Well, thank you for coming, everybody. We are so excited to have a chance to talk about this new coffee table book celebrating the sesquicentennial of the university. My name is Andrew Maraniss, and I'm the Special Projects Director at the Vanderbilt Athletic Department. And I have sort of a second career as an author of nonfiction books, primarily about sports and history, written for adults, teens, and as of March, also little kids, first and second graders. I'll have a new series coming out. But this was a really fun project for me to have a chance to work with a lot of people across campus. And this was a whole team that put this book together. Vanderbilt Sesquicentennial celebrating 150 years. And a big part of being able to put this book together was working with experts like Kathy Smith, who's joining us today from the University Archives. And so we just wanted to talk a bit about Vanderbilt history, about the archives, how this book was put together, and then happy to answer any questions that anyone has. But Kathy, thanks for coming today. And I've known you over the years, but I've never really heard the story of how you got into doing what you do at the archives and how you're so helpful. So many researchers and authors and students who come through that building, but how did you get where you are today?
Well, thank you. Let me see. I started as an undergraduate at a college up northeast, and I was a history major, and I didn't want to teach. I had gone through the history track, and I was talking to my advisor, and he had back then in the 90s, or actually the 80s, they had this big thick book of graduate schools, and so I was thumbing through it, and I was just like, archives administration, what is that? And he said, you know what, you'd be really good at that. And I looked it up, and I was like, ooh, it's like reading other people's mail. I love this. And so I went and got a degree at North Carolina State, and I worked briefly in the Northeast and was given the opportunity to come down to Vanderbilt as the reference archivist in the Special Collections and University Archives. And that was in '96, and worked my way through, and just really, history is about storytelling, as you know. And the archives in Special Collections are where the stories are. If you're not interviewing someone directly, then the stories are already in their letters and papers and things. And so that's really what keeps me going with everything. And I've had, like Andrew said, when you were working on the Perry Wallace materials and things like that, that was 10 years ago or more?
Yeah, it came out 10 years ago. So I worked on it for 8 years before that. So back to 2006 is, I think, when we first would have dealt with each other.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I remember a big part of Strong Inside was writing about the 1967 Impact Symposium when Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael came to campus. There's a picture of that event in here and a lot of other photos and materials related to Impact in the book. But the day that I came to the archives, and I don't remember if it was you or who was it, Lyle Langford that was around back then?
Lyle Langford was the historian.
Yeah, and set down a box of and said, "This is what you need to see." And I've just always been so impressed with, of all the millions of pieces of paper and photos and videos in the archives, how well everybody knows what's there. Can you describe sort of what the scope of the Vanderbilt Archives and Special Collections is?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been lucky in many ways that the leaders of the university, people like Robert McGaw and Mr. Poindexter, John Poindexter, and Lyle Langford, were prescient enough to collect these materials. The university archives were not sanctioned by the Board of Trust until the 1960s. And so before that, everything was stored in an attic somewhere. But when the Board of Trust authorized the beginnings of the university archives, then there began a semi-systematic way of going and, it's like, oh, Buttrick Hall's under construction. Let's go find out what they have in the attic and then take it. And to organize it the best way we can, which is to try to keep it in the order that it was created. An archivist's best friend is a good administrative assistant from a department who organizes the files and keeps them so that however they are best used by the leadership, that we will keep them in that order. So we have probably close to 13,000 linear feet of university archives, which if you think about it, that's 13,000 boxes. And the boxes are not exactly the same, but if you think of 13,000 copy paper boxes, it's a sort of an approximation of the size. And we've had generations of archivists and librarians going through and creating inventories to the folder titles and the record groups. And a record group is how we distinguish the originator of the materials. So there's a chancellor's office, provost office, there's the Department of Psychology, their, athletic department. Lots of different breakdowns, and we continue to break it down till we get to the folder level. And then in the folder, then it becomes a surprise. What's in that folder? And so it has become a organized sort of living being that we continue to try to shape into the best condition for researchers and for administrators and folks who are doing research, whether it be on a history of a department, a history of a person, history of the university, or it is someone who wants to know what their great-grandfather took when they were at Vanderbilt, way back in the 1800s.
And then I use these terms interchangeably. I know it's incorrect to do it, but I think about the archives and special collections, and I know those are really two different things. And special collections, when you go visit them, there's paintings, there's telephones, there's football helmets, trophies.
We have it all.
Film, going back, lots of Vanderbilt football film. Mm-hmm. What do you consider some of the most interesting or unusual pieces of the collection in the special collections?
Well, that's a tough one. That's like saying which child is your favorite. There are a lot of really fun things that, like the memorabilia that we collect. We recently took from the basement of Branscombe this summer a whole telephone booth that had been in Branscombe during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And that is great for interpretation because students today have a hard time thinking about what life was like before cell phones, when you had to pay and keep putting dimes in, if you wanted to call long distance. So that's fun. We also have a donor gave us a payphone out of one of the dormitories. So we've got that to go with it. But some of the things that really are very touching are the scrapbooks of alumna and alumni who kept record of their experience at Vanderbilt, and really interesting little side pieces that you wouldn't think of. That's how did they relate back to their brothers and sisters, with lots of letters, explaining to the younger siblings where they are and what they're doing. Really great pieces about how the university responded to different tragedies, more recent tragedy like 9/11 even. We are trying to collect and retain that kind of information. And then one of the best ways nowadays that we do it, and I know you do, is oral histories.
So if someone out here is a staff member or an alum of the university, and you're saying if they kept a diary during their time at Vanderbilt, you're interested in that sort of thing, or, you know, what sort of material are you looking for from people? What makes the cut to make it into the archives or the special collections?
Well, if it's unique, if it's a copy of the Hustler from 1997 and April 20th, we have it. And actually, it's digitized, so you can see it online. But unique items that are personal to you, Vanderbilt students' experience. Like from the past, we've got Letterman sweaters. We've got a pair of, what are those, black and white saddle shoes? Things like that that were worn and were emblematic of a time on campus. We recently received a single piece of paper from a woman from the early 1960s, and it was a welcome letter sent to the co-eds, the female students, telling them of the expectations of a female student at Vanderbilt. So it was that you would behave in a certain way, that you would wear skirts that are longer, that go over the knee, that there were 50-cent demerits for not being in your dorm. They basically locked the dorm down at 10 o'clock and you couldn't get in. So there were all of these things, and she just came across it, and she's like, do you want this? And I said, yes, this is a teaching thing. We can teach with this and show people how the university was back in that time period and what the students, part of what their experience would have been. So it could be something as simple as a letter, or something that's much more personal, like a scrapbook, or letters that they wrote back home to their parents, complaining about a faculty member and things like that. That's the fun stuff.
We tried not to include too many of those complaints in the coffee table book, but I think you're going to ask me some questions about the book, and then we'll take some from the audience.
Well, first of all, let me say that I really enjoyed working with Andrew on this. And it is a beautiful photographic album of the experiences of the students, faculty, staff, and alumni of the university. So when you got started on this, what was the process for starting to put the book together?
So this book is really the second of two books that are fairly similar. So last year was the 100th anniversary of Vanderbilt Stadium, football stadium. And so as someone that works at the athletic department, we wanted to commemorate that event. And so we worked with Whitman Publishing, same publisher as this book. They're known for their work with college athletic departments. They're the ones that do the celebratory coffee table book after Alabama wins the football championship, those sorts of books. And we contracted with them to create the book about Vanderbilt Stadium, really the whole history of Vanderbilt football. People on campus saw that book and thought, well, this would make a nice theme, similar format to celebrate the Sesquicentennial. So then it became a project of many departments across campus. I see Alex sitting back here, who is intimately involved in every step along the way, as were so many other people. But looking and Eric, who did so much scanning to make this possible. Looking at every issue of the alumni magazine from the moment it started, every yearbook in the history of the university. I wouldn't say all, but many issues of the Vanderbilt Hustler from over the years. Meeting with people on campus that are collectors of things, like Randy Tarkington has a great collection in his office. In the athletic department, looking through the files there, Phil Nagy was unbelievable. He's in the special collections and has all of the athletic department archives right now. Meeting with professors like John Locks, who recently passed away, the great philosophy professor. he was cleaning out his office to move out of Furman Hall, and his daughter brought me over, and we looked through all of his 50 years worth of items that he had saved from his career here. So collecting items from many sources, having it all scanned, and then the book is divided into decade chapters, and they're each around 10 pages, 10 or 12 pages. So clearly there was much more material than we were able to use in the book. It's meant to be something that you can pick up on any page and just read some nuggets on that page rather than a narrative that you have to read from beginning to end. I feel like that's what people want in a coffee table book, so picking out interesting nuggets that tell the history that may or may not be related to the photos that you also see on that page that are also telling the story of the university during that particular decade. And trying to keep a mix of different aspects of university life. So, research and scientific breakthroughs, just campus life, notable personalities on campus, building projects, athletics, Greek life. It's primarily from the standpoint of being a student at Vanderbilt, I would say. Although as you get into later decades, more recent decades, it becomes, you'll see more about the changing Nashville around it also, and the one thing that's very obvious through the book is the increasing diversity of the student body at Vanderbilt. And along with that, you see the university getting better, no coincidence, but that becomes very clear when you flip through the pages decade by decade.
That's really interesting because I think what I noticed in here was that it's very hard to pick 10 years and only have 10 pages to really describe some of the very significant things that went on. So what were some of the themes that you saw emerging decade after decade?
Yeah, one of them was, maybe it's obvious, but growth, in all sorts of ways. The campus becoming a bigger physical footprint, growth in terms of the number of students here, growth in terms of the diversity of the student body, growth in terms of Vanderbilt's mindset also, from initially being very sort of provincial and local college to then having aspirations to be the best university in the South, then to one of the best in the country, now, one of the best in the world. And just so the way the university sees itself is a theme that emerges over the course of the book. And then I would say leadership also, and being a place that aspires to have an impact, like I said, whether it's regionally or nationally or internationally, and never really shying away from that, but looking for those opportunities to be a leader.
Well, that, like I said, that's a lot to get into just 150 years for basically a couple hundred pages. So this is, once again, a hard one, but what are some of your favorite things that you found out, or some of the favorite images that you used in here?
Okay, and I've got a cheat sheet on that one, but a few of my favorite pictures. There's one, I don't know if you have the book with you, but everyone will have different favorites. In the introduction section of VII, a student of my era, so I graduated in 92, and it's embarrassing when pictures from your era are in black and white, but there's a picture from Satco, students with their bucket of Rolling Rock sitting on the porch at Satco, and that, to me, there's no more Vanderbilt picture than a picture that's not even on campus, right? But being at Satco, and there's a picture of Mama Rotier's daughter at Rotier's, which, R.I.P. Rotier's. Those are some of my favorite pictures, because that really evokes this campus to me. There's a picture on page 41 of a snowball fight from 1927 in front of Benson Hall, old science building. And looking through photo archives, it was really incredible to me how many snowball fight pictures our Vanderbilt photographers have taken over the years. Any chance for snow, the photographer was outside, and the students
I was going to say,
doing
they're
the
out
same
roaming
thing for 100 years. I thought that was funny. Page 64, and there's a few pictures like this in the book. It's an overhead shot. It shows the area around the football stadium and Memorial Gym. But more interesting to me than those two buildings, which are still there, are the streets around it and how the campus has changed so dramatically over the years. This was 1958, but just the neighborhoods that existed in the campus footprint now. And like I say, there's a few pictures like this. I thought it would be fun for people to see how campus and the city changed around it. On page 80, there's a picture of students in 1966 picking up their copies of the Vanderbilt Hustler student newspaper on Rand, on the wall at Rand. And to me, it's evocative of a time where you can see all the stacks of newspapers there and how many students are crowded around to get the news.
Hot
one of
off
the only
press,
ways they could get the news then, but also just that wall at Rand being such a gathering spot for students ever since it was built, then and now. And then on page 96 is probably my favorite picture in the book, and it's just my own warped sense of humor. There was an actual dumpster fire on campus, and VUPD showing up on the scene of the dumpster fire. So those are some of my favorites. In terms of the nuggets in the book, there's one about John Tigert, who was the first. We have a young 3-month-old, 4-month-old baby here today. So John Tigert was the first baby ever born on the Vanderbilt campus. He went on to become the Secretary of Education and the President of the University of Florida. He's a Rhodes Scholar, played football at Vanderbilt, and is credited with inventing the athletic scholarship, the concept of the athletic scholarship. So that's a nugget I don't think most people are familiar with. There's a story that Stella Vaughn, so the Vaughn House on campus, and Stella Vaughn, really considered the mother of women's sports at Vandy. She tells a story about in the early 1900s teaching a group of women to play football, and they were doing it inside the old gym, and she got tackled hard and said that she walked around campus with splinters in her body for a couple of weeks after that. And just thinking about women in the early 1900s playing indoor football and walking around with splinters, she told that in oral history. There's a nugget about the medical center and the renovations in 1980. And at the time, it was written about that no one will forget this day. It just made me think about how many things happen in your own lifetime, and you think everyone's always going to remember this. And now we think about the hospital, the medical center always being there. And if you show up a day after something's happened, kind of assume it's always been that way, or if a building's torn down the year before you get here, you never even knew it existed. And that really came through to me in working on this book, like what you take for granted because of your brief time here on this campus and what you're maybe unaware of. And then, I don't know if James Moore is here, the landscape architect. He gave this great speech at the Sesquicentennial tree planting. And it's one of my favorite passages in the book, and I'm just quoting from his speech. He was talking about the significance of trees on this campus, which is so significant. The arboretum, and there's a few pictures of squirrels in the book because you can't have a Vanderbilt book without squirrels. But he said, in modern discussions about trees today, we're often asked to quantify their utility, how much oxygen they provide, how much carbon they store, how much they reduce flooding, how many other species they support. All of this is important. But what I find wonderful about trees is their refusal to be defined solely by numbers. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "This curious world we inhabit is more wonderful than convenient, more beautiful than it is useful. It is more to be admired and enjoyed than used." Unquote. Trees inspire, they uplift us. In a world that often asks us to justify every act with a number, trees silently simply are. And so
that is pretty
I love
profound.
that James had that to say. And so that's included towards the end of the book, followed by sort of a by the numbers of the Vanderbilt Arboretum, the names and numbers of the most populous trees on campus.
That's really interesting. So just looking through this again, as you were going through it, how many photographs do you think that you initially selected and then had to winnow down?
Oh, wow. Well, it was in the thousands originally. It's probably close to 1,000 pictures that are still in the book. maybe 3,000 or 4,000 that we started with and had to narrow it down. It was tough. You could make an equally good book with everything that was cut out of this book.
Yeah. I mean, you could make a book just on the landscape of campus. So
yeah, and there are several old maps of campus throughout each chapter, so you can see what buildings were on campus at a particular time, or how the direction that the campus moved changed over the years.
So that sort of leads me to a question of, like, what are your general interests in Vanderbilt history, and do you see any future Vanderbilt kind of projects going? I know that you've got a bunch in the fire, sort of irons in the fire already.
Yeah. Well, my interest in Vanderbilt history started, I guess, before I arrived here as a student. I went to high school in Austin, Texas. I'd never been to Nashville before, never really heard of Vanderbilt before, but we were talking about Fred Russell before we got started. Old timers in the audience remember Fred Russell. He was the sports editor of the Nashville Banner for 50, 60, 70 years, and he's a alum of Vanderbilt of the early 20s, late teens. He was still living, and there was a scholarship named after him when I was in high school for high school sports writers. And so I applied for it, and I was fortunate to get it, and that's why I came to Nashville and to Vanderbilt. And so when I arrived on campus, he was one of the first people that I met, and he would take the scholarship winners to lunch at the university club and tell us stories. So the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior winners would go with him to lunch, and he would point out at a table, and as we walked in, he'd say, there's, Hurd and Branscombe. And to us, Branscombe was the dorm we lived in, and Hurd was the library, so seeing these real people was a bit of a shock at first, but then he would tell us stories about these old figures in Vanderbilt history, and especially stories about old football teams, and basketball teams and athletes. And that's what I was most interested in at the time. And so I always felt connected to Vanderbilt history in a way, thanks to Mr. Russell. And then my sophomore year, I was taking a Black history course taught by Dr. Yolette Jones, and I wrote a paper about Perry Wallace for her class. And so having the experience of writing about a Vanderbilt alum from the 60s and his experience as a pioneer, and understanding Vanderbilt was, not always, for almost 100 years, we were behind the times, right? But then in the 1960s, things begin to change, and learning that history was really interesting to me, and I loved writing about that aspect in Strong Inside. I don't necessarily have another Vanderbilt history book within me right now, but one thing I think that I would like to do, in working on this project, I was kind of loaned out from the athletic department to campus, is a better way of saying it. And what I'd like to do as a project this year, if there's an opportunity, is to really look at Impact Symposium of 1967 and 68, which I think you could argue is the most interesting events ever to happen on the campus. So in 1967, with MLK, Stokely Carmichael, Strom Thurmond, Allen Ginsberg on campus, I wrote in Strong Inside, that was like the 1960s arriving at Vanderbilt. And then the next year, Robert F. Kennedy coming to campus, King being killed shortly after he speaks here, RFK being killed shortly after he speaks here, just what was discussed. And that is another theme that I should have mentioned when you asked about that, was the idea of the open forum has carried through all the way from the very beginning. And I should read that. So when the university was founded, and then we can do audience questions, there was a speech at the dedication of the university, which sounds just like something Chancellor Hurd would say, or something Chancellor Dearmeyer would say. And this was Professor Andrew Lipscomb, October 3rd, 1875. He said, the university is bound to recognize every department of true thought, every branch of human knowledge, every mode of thorough culture, and moreover to give each and all its sympathy, its support, its furtherance. Narrowness, overloaded bias, chronic prejudices are fatal to its aims. One-sided universities make one-sided men, and one-sided men are never honest students or reliable scholars. What is best in the university is the catholicity of its views. Against what is local and sectional, it must resolutely set itself and take its stand on whatever is large-minded or enduring. And so that was a charge from the very beginning. And, it's so similar to what Chancellor Hurd said in the 60s about making the campus a safe place for ideas, not to protect students from ideas, but to help them develop their own ideas, and then to the open forum discussions we have today.
Well, it's true. It really is a kind of a thread that weaves itself through. And I'm excited about this 1960s impact research, because it was also very important, because Heard was able to resist the conservative board of trust and let the students choose who they wanted to bring, which was seen as sort of controversial.
Yeah, right in the midst of what was at that time the biggest fundraising drive in the university's history, probably have the most controversial event in the university history, and they exceeded the fundraising goals they had. Robert Eager, who was the student head of Impact, who invited King to campus, was just here last week. I met him, and so I wanted to do an oral history with him and the other students that were involved that year and the following year. That's a big part of this.
Great. Well, I hope they end up in the archives.
I'm sure they will. All right. Well, thanks, Kathy.
Yeah,
thanks everybody
everyone.
for coming. I know people are busy in the middle of their workday. Hopefully you were able to pick up a copy of the book. If anyone has any questions before we go, either one of us would be happy to answer.
Sure.
And if not, there's great refreshments over here and books. Lauren? All right.
Lauren.
So what do you both of you view as, like, if you had to pick the most pivotal event of Vanderbilt's history, like one, what do you think it would be? I don't know if you can do it. I don't know.
I mean, to me, it's kind of what I'm talking about with impact. I think that it, like, literally and symbolically, it was an important event in university history in terms of living up. Couldn't be a great university without something like that having happened, and opening up the campus to broader thought, to participating in the civil rights movement in a way, opening up the campus to more diverse student body, having students that would even want to do that in the first place probably wouldn't have happened 10 or 20, 10 years before that, less than 10 years before that student body voted against integration, so that was a really pivotal moment in showing the university was changing and helped propelling it to change.
Mine is, it may sound controversial today, but at the time, I think it allowed the university to continue and not fail. And it was the break in 1914 with the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And not because of the religion, but because Northern foundations would not give money to institutions that were of one particular religion. And Chancellor Kirkland did so much footwork with the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the General Education Board and things like that. But they all had to hold back because they basically were saying, we can't do this as long as you are beholden to the College of Bishops in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And I was doing a lot of reading on this for the exhibit that we put up. And it's interesting, Kirkland never really wanted a true break with the Methodist Church. It came to a head when the Methodist bishops countersued Vanderbilt. At the time when Vanderbilt was created, there was a rule about there had to be so many bishops on the Board of Trust. And, they wanted a very particular kind of institution, which was an academic one, a liberal arts one, but also very beholden to the religion. And Kirkland wasn't against that, but he saw that a board of trust that was full of bishops who had relatively sworn themselves to moderate poverty, that they were not going to be able to really bring in the manufacturing, the money and the prestige and the forward thinking that was needed. And when that happened, when the split happened and the Tennessee Supreme Court ruled in favor of Vanderbilt, literally within a week or two, money started coming from the Northern Foundations. And that allowed Vanderbilt to be in a relatively good stead when 15 or 20, not even 20 years later, when the crash happened and the Depression started. And a lot of institutions really struggled, and Vanderbilt didn't have to because it had laid this foundation. And so it's not quite as sexy as some of the other things, but I think, there were a number of pivotal points where the university could have maybe sustained itself and then gone a different direction. But, I had the understanding that Kirkland wanted a break from the church completely, and he didn't. He was a very strong Methodist himself, and in reading more about him and reading his letters, it was a very hard line for him to walk. But we're here today.
We're not SMU because of it.
That's
Right?
right.
Yes.
So you mentioned that the medical center was built in the 80s, but
There
there
were-
was a school of medicine that
Yes.
existed.
Yeah, no, this was just the renovation of it. I'm talking about. Yes.
So there was an interesting relationship between the school of medicine, the medical center, and you, of course, came to a head.
Right. And so that split is discussed in the book, and yeah, and then there's pictures in the early sections of the book when the medical school was downtown,
Right, when it was still part of the University of
down
Nashville.
by the Howard School. Right.
So actually, the medical school goes back
The dental
further. Oh, and the dental. We had a dental school. Did y'all? I mean, who knew? We had a pharmacy school. Yeah, you guys knew the history of medicine, men.
Here.
This is kind of a fun one, but is there something about Vanderbilt campus life today, or campus in general, that we hope is immortalized, remembered 50, 60 years from now? What do we see today?
Oh, part of Vanderbilt campus life today that is memorialized, remembered. Yellen?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is the way that the technology has really changed student life. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about this because working on the time capsule and the history of the university. And just, I mean, gosh, the COVID. I mean, the library set up faculty to have all these remote resources, and the Center for Teaching work to make sure that faculty could teach remotely. And now we're still in a hybrid society. So I think that is going to be another turning point. That and the Opportunity Vanderbilt. I think those are some, in the past 4 or 5 years, kind of things that are super pivotal.
Okay. From a tangible aspect of answering your questions, I would say one thing you notice in looking at the book is there used to be more just space on campus. Some of it used well, some of it just surface parking lots, which thankfully are not as many. But hopefully the arboretum aspect of the university will still be the same 50 years from now. The baseball glove lounge, I hope that there's always a baseball glove lounge. I think that actual couch has changed a couple times maybe, but right, I think the baseball glove was changed once, at least. And then my favorite place on campus, and I don't think most people would say this, but Memorial Gym is my favorite spot on campus. I remember walking into that building when I was a freshman, back before there was a rec center. So students, that's where you would also play basketball, in your intramural games, and just being so impressed with that building in the middle of campus and the balconies and how loud it would get during a big game, and then learning that that's where Perry Wallace made history. And my wife and I had our rehearsal dinner there before we got married, like that building itself, and it's showing its age for sure, but I hope that it's just renovated and not flattened someday. I think that's an important
be
piece
bad,
of this
yeah.
campus.
Yeah, and the Impact Lecture Series were held there. We have the ginormous flag. So we won't bring it out because it's like 80 by 100 feet. But we have it.
Yeah, I saw it a couple years ago when it was unfurled outside the library.
That's right. That
cool.
was a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming. And thank you to everybody in this audience that had a big piece of putting this book together. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.